Joe, is the sound on? Well, thank you all for being here this morning. We're glad you're here on a breezy day, and I think you'll find that the photograph that's on the screen behind me sort of fits the kind of weather we're having today. This picture was taken on a Sunday afternoon, April the 14th, 1935, and not a whole lot of us were there to witness this, but it was called the Day of the Black Blizzard. And it wasn't uncommon during that era to have these huge dust storms. In fact, in the year 1933, for example, there were 139 recorded black blizzards. But on April 14th, 1935, it was the daddy of them all, and it was this one. And it started in southeastern Colorado, just across the state line from Elkhart, Kansas. And it started late in the morning. And it began moving south. It moved into Kansas, it moved across the Oklahoma Panhandle, the Texas Panhandle, most of Oklahoma. In fact, it went clear to the Gulf. It went to Washington, D.C., where the street lights came on in the middle of the day. It's the biggest dust storm ever recorded in this country. 300 million tons of dust were in that cloud. But the important thing for us today is it started with a single grain of sand. One blew a little bit, bumped into another, dislodged another. And so in a matter of hours, this incredible cloud grew and started rolling across the landscape. It was different from just having the lights go out. If you were inside a house, for instance, turned on the lights, they didn't work. Wouldn't penetrate that dust. It was on a Sunday afternoon, and that was an era when almost everyone went to church. And if they went to church, the odds were pretty good. They heard a sermon that had something to do with hellfire and brimstone. That was the vogue of the day. So the reaction to this thing was the world is ending. Some people took their lives because they were so afraid of it. Woody Guthrie sat in the Texas Panhandle and wrote a song in reaction to that, and it was called "So Long It's Been Good to Know You." Well, things calmed down, of course, and ultimately the Dust Bowl ended. But the key thing to remember, 1 grain of sand, 300 million tons of topsoil eventually moved out in this cloud on this particular day. The point we want to make is that tiny little things can have incredibly great results. And we're going to talk about the book of Nehemiah today, so if you want to grab a Bible and turn over there, we'll skip through it in a minute. But again, remember that there are people, and Nehemiah will turn out to be one of them, who because of the things they do and the steps they take are able to have a profound effect upon the world around them. Here's a little quiz that gives us an idea of some of this. And this, if you get all 6 answers correct on this, you'll get your name in the drawing for the door prize at the end, which I think is a new Mercury, as I recall, that we're having today. But question number 1 is, he was born in Georgia. His dad was a shoemaker. His mom was a farm worker. She wanted him to be a priest. He went to a seminary, but instead of actually going into religious work, he got into politics. And as a result of that, he became ultimately a tyrant who was responsible for the deaths of millions of people. Now, you can jot your answer down on your bulletin or on the palm of your hand or wherever you do these kinds of things, and keep it for just a minute. Question number 2, he was a small-town preacher, but he took on arguably the most powerful man on earth at that time and won. And his legacy still lives on. Question number 3, he was a law student. His father was a wealthy farmer. He persuaded his brother to help him. They took over the country, and he became a perpetual thorn in the side of the United States. Question number 4. She was a sickly child. She was very shy. She was introverted. She got a job as a teacher but didn't like it and went to work as a clerk in the federal patent office. And after she did that for a while, war broke out, so she devoted herself to helping wounded soldiers on the battlefield. And this led to the formation of the largest humanitarian organization in the United States. And who was she? The next question. He was 24 years old. He lived in New York State. He founded a religious group he called the Church of Christ. 14 years later, an angry mob killed him. But his religious legacy lives right now as probably the fastest growing church in the world. And who was this guy? And finally, his father was a beekeeper. He was an aspiring artist. He loved opera. He was a corporal in the army, but he came very close to conquering Europe. So who is this guy? Okay, any answers among you for question number 1? Born in Georgia, father a cobbler, etc. His name is number A up there, and I have absolutely no idea how to pronounce it, but he took on the name of Joseph Stalin. Number 2 is Martin Luther, who basically led what turned out to be a revolution against the Pope and the practices of papacy. C is Fidel Castro. D, Clara Barton Stone, who worked during the Civil War, led to the American Red Cross being founded. Joseph Smith, who founded what he called the Church of Christ, is now the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Interestingly, if you're in the Kansas City area, there are some churches of Christ there that still are remnants of what he founded. There was a group in Kansas City, an independence actually, called the Reformed Latter-day Saints, who were an offshoot of the mainstream Mormons, and they now are the Community of Christ. But some of their congregations retained the Church of Christ name. And finally, the answer is Adolf Hitler. So all of these people, without a whole lot of credentials at the beginning, were able to do something that had an impact on the world around them, in some cases for centuries. And Jesus talked about this. He said, if you have enough faith, even a tiny, tiny bit of faith, you can make a mountain move. Now, I think he was speaking metaphorically, because I have never in my life heard of anyone who was able to actually physically move a mountain without the help of a lot of dynamite and bulldozers. But nonetheless, Jesus was making the point that if you have the faith, and if you have the vision, and if you have the foresight, and probably implied in that is a plan, it's possible to move mountains and to have a huge impact on what goes on in the world all around us. So now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about Nehemiah. When I started thinking about this lesson today, I was sort of mentally casting it out for someone who had done great, memorable things, but did it without the help of miraculous powers. For instance, Saul of Tarsus was walking down the road. He had a miraculous conversion. People like Moses and Abraham and others that we consider to be the heroes of faith from the Old Testament all had some kind of direct communication with God. And Jonah had his own line of communication that was moved around quite a bit. But Nehemiah didn't seem to have these things. If we look at the record, if we look at the book of Nehemiah, there's no indication that he had any direct line to God, that God intervened in his life in any miraculous way. We'll see that Nehemiah is a man of great faith, that he relied heavily upon God, that he was in constant communication with him in the form of prayer, but never the lightning bolt that came down and struck him, as maybe it did in the case of Saul of Tarsus. So here we have this guy. This occurred about 500 years before Jesus, something like 490 BC. The Jews had been in captivity with the Babylonians for 70 years at this point, and they began going back to Jerusalem. 3 waves of them went back. First one was led by a man named Zerubbabel, and then one by Ezra, and the third wave, as we'll see, was then led by Nehemiah. Nehemiah is in a city called Susa, S-U-S-A, which was the winter capital of Persia. He was serving the king. Susa is about 500 miles across the desert from Jerusalem. So any trip from there is going to be a pretty arduous one. You could walk, many did. You could upgrade to business class and ride a donkey, or you could go a step further and ride a camel. But however you did it, it was going to be a long, sore trip. 500 miles across the desert, not many holiday inns between the 2 cities. Yet the Jews were moving back across this great distance. Zerubbabel first, Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah wound up getting their own book. Zerubbabel didn't. Maybe they couldn't spell his name, I'm not quite sure. And as you probably know, Ezra and Nehemiah at one point, and today still in the Jewish Bible, are one book. And there's a very real continuity between the 2. So we have Nehemiah, this man, in the capital of Susa, and he wants to go back to Jerusalem. And we can conclude pretty safely that he had a real vision, he had a real purpose. He really wanted to go. And there were specific reasons for that. So we look at some of the opening statements in the book of Nehemiah. And point number 1 is he really studied the situation. The opening 3 verses of that book talk about how he got his information. His brother, whose name was Hananiah, had come back from Jerusalem. And Nehemiah asked him how things were going, and essentially they were going very badly. Hananiah tells him that the walls are torn down, the gates have been burned, there's really nothing there, it's a disgrace. Now, in this period of time, 500 years approximately before Christ, for any city not to have walls meant it was open to any kind of an invader, even a bandit group who wanted to ride in at night. So it was not a place of safety. It was not a place that was to be the home of God himself. Rather, it was a desolate chunk of place where some people were living, some who had newly come back, some who had managed to stay there during the exile period. So question number 2, or point number 2, I should say, what was it that he did about this? Well, he reflected on the problem and he sought divine help. Now, at the outset, I said we wanted somebody to talk about today who didn't have the same kind of divine commission that, say, Saul of Tarsus had. Rather, this was an individual who didn't have that, but he really knew that because he was a man of faith, he had to have help from God. So he did 2 things. One of them was he was so sorrowful that for days he sat down and wept. He obviously was hugely concerned about what was going on. But the next thing he did was pray. Now, the prayer that's reproduced in the book of Nehemiah is pretty short. And the indication is that this prayer went on for several days. So probably this is kind of a summary of what went on in that prayer. And then within it, he did 3 things. First, he confessed. He said, I have sinned, my family has sinned, the Israelites as a nation has sinned, and we're repenting of that right now. The second thing he did, which was kind of interesting even sort of borders on arrogance. He reminded God of what God had promised. He said effectively, God, you have told us that if we didn't behave, we would be scattered all over the world, but that if we came back to you, we could be restored. And for some reason, he thought God needed to know that, and that maybe he had forgotten it, but nonetheless, he pointed that out. And then the third thing he did was pray for success that day. And he says, give me help with this man, and by that he meant with the man who was the ruler of Persia and the one who held in his hand really the success that Nehemiah sought. This next point, he took advantage of the circumstances to act on the plan he had made. His job was being cupbearer to the king. Anybody recall another cupbearer to the king that was important in Old Testament history? Joseph was a cupbearer to the king. Cupbearer to the king can be looked at in a couple of ways. One, it was important because it meant that the king had absolute trust in this individual, because this was the guy who brought the wine to the king. If anyone had a chance to poison the king, it was Nehemiah or Joseph or whoever it was. So they had to have total trust that Nehemiah, in this case, was allied with the king and was not going to allow anything to happen to him. The probability is that in the presence of the king, he tested the wine. Now, if you like wine, this is a pretty good job. The problem is that if somebody has slipped some poison in, you're also the canary in the coal mine, and your death instantly warns the king that he probably doesn't want to drink the wine. This was his job, cupbearer to the king, and it was a very important job, and it signifies a lot of trust. But then the interesting thing is the king said, "Why do you look so sad today?" Now, this implies, of course, that he knew him very well. He knew a sad look from a happy look. But think for a minute the implications of that. Here this guy is bringing you your wine to drink, and he looks sad. So there is a pretty logical question to ask. Is he sad because he's been breaking out in scarlet fever, for instance? You'd want to know that. But he did ask why you look so sad. And that was the opening Nehemiah needed. He told him he was sad because he'd heard these reports about what was going on in Jerusalem. But then he said, I prayed and asked the king. Time after time, this pattern exists, that before Nehemiah does something that's important, asks something that's important, prayer is involved in it. Now, at some point, Nehemiah had made a plan that he understood very well. So you remember that one of his prayers to God, the third part of it was that he have success this day when he talked to the king, and he was ready to talk to the king. He had things that he wanted from him. Number one is he wanted letters to the governors that he would encounter along the way, so they would know he was a legitimate representative of the king and that they would let him pass through their lands on his way from Susa over to Jerusalem. He also wanted permission to get wood from the king's forest, so he asked for a letter to Asaph, the guy who was in charge of the timber industry, and that was arranged. And in fact, the king went further. He gave him a cavalry escort to go with him across the desert. One of the problems with that long travel during that era, and before and since, is that there were a lot of quasi-guerrilla bands operating. There were robbers, so anyone who went across needed protection, and Nehemiah had not specifically asked for it, but he got it. Asked for lumber, he asked for safe passage, he got those, and he also got the king's permission to use the cavalry. So, not much is said, in fact, nothing is really said about the trip itself. Apparently, it went without any kind of noteworthy incident. And incidentally, one of the things that's interesting, particularly about the book of Nehemiah, is it switches back and forth from first person to third person. So some of it he apparently wrote or dictated himself, and some of it apparently was written by somebody else as he went along. But it tells of his arrival in Jerusalem, and he encounters a couple of people who don't like him. These are Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite, and they are an interesting pair. Sanballat became the high priest of the Samaritans. And if you remember, the Samaritans were comprised principally of the Jewish people who had been left behind. The Babylonians didn't take them into exile, and the reason they didn't was they didn't want them. Generally speaking, these were unskilled. They were not the people who were leaders. They weren't the teachers. They weren't the prophets. They were sort of the despicables, as somebody who once described people. So out of that arose the Samaritan group, and Sanballat, the Horonite, was the high priest thereof. Tobiah, his aide-de-camp, was descended from a family that came back with Zerubbabel. But for some reason that isn't clear, that family was not accepted by the Jews, so he allied himself with Sanballat and became a leader among the Samaritans. Actually, he was sort of the aide-de-camp. But these two led the opposition. They really were in charge of Jerusalem, or at least they thought they were to this point, and they didn't like the idea of these interlopers coming back. So he sought, he being Nehemiah, the concurrence of the leadership of the Jews. He had something that he wanted to do, but in order to accomplish that, he had to have the assistance of all the people. So he went to the leaders. He said, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. I'm pretty sure that's a summary of what he's talking about. But we will no longer be a disgrace. Good reason. We need to rebuild them. We don't want to be seen in the eyes of the world as failures. Therefore, we don't want to be a disgrace. We have the gracious hand of God on our side. So the people said, let's start rebuilding. The leadership then in front, he was able to bring control to the situation from that point forward. He effectively put aside the opposition. Sanballat, Tobiah, and there'll soon be another guy named Geshem the Arab, and others were lined up against him. And when the opposition heard what they were going to do, they basically started out. First they said, are you rebelling against the king? And then they started making fun of him. In fact, I think it was Tobiah who goes on to say, look what they're doing. They build this stupid wall, and if a fox steps on it, it'll fall down. So they were using mockery effectively, or trying to use mockery as a weapon against the Jews carrying out this plan that they had that in their eyes was absurd. Now it's interesting that there have been excavations done, of course, and they're ongoing in Jerusalem. And one of the things they find is when they excavate the walls archaeologically now is that there obviously was a period when the walls were rebuilt just by kind of heaping up rubble. And that probably is what's going to turn out to be the case now with Nehemiah and the leadership. When they start putting this back together, it's going to be something less than a work of art, but it will be effective. And then he did an important thing, something that any leader has to do. If you remember, we were talking about these people, Castro and Hitler and Stalin and others, had to have the will of the people on their side. They couldn't have accomplished what they accomplished without it, nor could Nehemiah accomplish it if he doesn't have it. I said that the archaeological discovery is that there are parts of the wall that appear to have been built out of rubble. This is part of the reason. When they started rebuilding it, they assigned sections of the wall to various groups of people. And they had no skills. There were no stonemasons, there were no carpenters. Instead, the text tells us that these people were goldsmiths, that they were merchants, that they were priests. They were just a bunch of people who got together and started trying to stack stones one upon the other with varying degrees of success. But they did it. The entire community was involved, and that's one reason that points toward their success. Next point, he reacted quickly and firmly when opposition was threatened. There's an underlined phrase there. This scripture says, he, Sanballat, ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of the army of Samaria, was very angry. They plotted together to come fight. This isn't just a couple of guys who are priests for the local synagogue. They have the entire army of Samaria apparently arranged in some kind of formation, probably a battle formation. And in doing and reacting like this, Sanballat basically is saying, let's get these guys. So it takes an act of courage to face them. But Nehemiah does what he needed to do. He prayed to God, again, that necessary prelude, and he posted a guard. So the question becomes, does this demonstrate a lack of faith on Nehemiah's part, that he prays and posts a guard? Any thoughts on that? Michael has a microphone if anybody would like to hold up a hand and
I don't see a contradiction because God gives us wisdom to do things to carry out on his behalf.
Okay. God uses us to carry out things on his behalf. Anything else? Well, I think John's absolutely right that it doesn't indicate any lack of faith on the part of Nehemiah. Again, it is his habit, and he prays and he gets what he needs. The Jews responded positively to what Nehemiah was asking them to do. And this is one of my personal favorite phrases in the book of Nehemiah. It said they got to work, they got the wall half built, and they did that because they worked with all their heart. In other words, the people were enthusiastic in their response, and as a result of that enthusiasm, they were able to very quickly get the walls up to half their height. The people, rather understandably, were fearful. So Nehemiah, tried to appeal to their own emotions to keep them going, and he said, or the people were saying, no matter what we do, no matter where we turn, they will attack us. Nehemiah said, don't be afraid. Remember, you're here, you're fighting for your brothers and your sisters and your daughters and wives and mothers in your homes. So these are the important things that he's reminding them of, that is the reason, or that are the reasons for their being there. He quieted their fears by appealing to the important. And he had a workable defensive plan. And this is pretty interesting. From that day on, half my men did the work, while the others had their weapons ready. And then even those who were carrying the stuff back and forth carried whatever they were carrying in one hand and a sword in the other. And each builder wore his sword at his side. And they continued to work from dawn until the stars came out. So they were putting in very long days. The men stayed inside, so they were guard inside the walls. So they were on guard day and night, and none of us even took off our clothes to go to bed, is what he's saying. Everyone had a weapon. along the way, there was so much emphasis on rebuilding the walls that some other things apparently were being neglected. And the people come to him and they say, we're having to borrow money to pay our taxes. We've had to mortgage our fields trying to get enough to eat. We've had to sell our sons and daughters into slavery to come up with some money. And Nehemiah apparently hadn't noticed this. And he addressed the Jewish people, the leadership, and really reamed them out for letting this happen. Apparently, some of the better off Jews had been lending money at usurious rates to the people, and they were reaping great profits while the masses of the people were going hungry. So he stopped that practice. He made those who had made these loans give back the fields and homes on which they held mortgages. He made them apparently give back the interest that had been charged, and things were going on. But the key thing is, Nehemiah, addressed the very real needs of the people. The wall was completed in 52 days. And the question then is, how did this affect Jerusalem's entries? Incidentally, that 52 days is about how long it would have taken for them to get from Susa to Jerusalem. So what we're talking about here is a whole thing that occurred in about 3 months. When the enemies of the Jews heard that they had been so successful in completing the wall so quickly, they were afraid, and because they realized that this was done with the help of God. They literally put the fear of God in their enemies by having done this so quickly. Even after the walls were built, however, he realized the need to have a strong defense. So he kept rules. The gates were not opened until after sunrise. One of the problems that they instantly had were that there were people who were neighbors to the Jews who were coming in on the Sabbath selling things which was in violation of Jewish law. So Nehemiah, ordered that the gates be closed at times and they're not to be open except in specific things. He also continued to meet the people's spiritual needs. These have been obviously very badly neglected. All the people assembled before the water gate. They told Ezra the scribe to bring out the law of Moses, and he read from it, and the people listened. And they found written in the law that the Israelites were to celebrate a special feast. This feast turns out to be the one that's called the Feast of the Booths, or the Tents, or the Tabernacles. It commemorates the time when the Jews were going across the desert and they were living in these makeshift quarters. It says that it had not been observed since the time of Joshua, and that's about 1,000 years, so it had really fallen into disuse. But they heard it read from the law that they were to do it, so they reestablished that feast. Still observed today. If you drive by the temple on East Central, they build a booth during the appropriate time of each year and have the celebration that was ordered at that time. That temple, incidentally, has combined with the synagogue on North Woodlawn, so I'm not sure if they're going to still be doing it, but they have been doing that in the past. But the key thing is, Nehemiah restored the law of God, the law of Moses, and they had some very long readings of it to the people. How did the Israelites respond? Well, they gathered together, they started to fast, they started wearing sackcloth, they put dust on their heads. You remember that this book, with Nehemiah confessing his own sins and those of the people of Israel. And now he has reached the point where all the people of Israel are beginning to do the same thing. They gather together, they fast, they wear sackcloth, they confess their sins and the sins of their fathers. They read aloud from the book of the law for a quarter of the day, and they spent another quarter confessing and worshiping the Lord. I'm not quite sure what a quarter of the day was, but I guess it's 3 or 4 hours. So if we were to gather and read from the New Testament for 4 hours, I'm not sure what our attendance would be, but nonetheless, that's what they were doing, and then they were worshiping on that. Now, these are really important. This is what people were moved to do, and it occupies quite a bit of chapter 10. They agreed to follow the law of God, to obey carefully all the commands, and this third one is an interesting one. We will not have intermarriage with the people around us. We will not buy on the Sabbath. We'll have a Sabbath year every 7th year. We'll give 1/3 of a shekel to the service of the house of God, cast lots to decide who brings wood for the altar, bring the first fruits, bring the firstborn, bring the priest the first of our ground meal, and bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, and we will not neglect the house of God, they said. So these were vast changes for these people who had been in Babylon, where these things had been basically forgotten, overlooked, or whatever for 70 years. It's interesting to keep in mind that the people who came with Nehemiah and a little earlier with Ezra and still a little earlier with Zerubbabel had not lived in Jerusalem before, that there was no one left alive among these exiles, or at least very few left alive, who had lived in Jerusalem before the exile into Babylon. That 70-year period had taken care of that population. Someone who was 40 years old at the time of the exile would have had to have been 110 by the time of Nehemiah. So it didn't happen. These were people who really didn't have firsthand experience with Jerusalem and with the worship as it was done then. So then they celebrated the success, and I think this is important for us to remember, that when we do something that succeeds, we celebrate it. And it must have been a really great celebration. They had what amounted to bands, they had choirs, they marched around the walls, they went in both directions. Then they had feasts and all kinds of festivals to it. I assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. They offered great sacrifices. They let God know they appreciated his help in all of this. He continued the reform movement. After the celebration of success, he realized that things had to continue to go on. He went back to report to Artaxerxes before this last section happens. And he discovers that while he's gone, and we don't know exactly how long that was, in fact, we don't know how long that was, when he came back, he found things were not going as smoothly as when he left them. The Jews have this great habit of starting down a course toward God, and then something happens, they let up a little bit, and they begin to swerve away from it, and that was happening here. So he has to continue his reform movement. He excluded from Israel all the people of foreign descent. They were really, really intent on stopping intermarriage, and we'll see, interestingly, something about that. Tobiah, one of the original antagonists of the Jews, somehow had sort of crept his way back in, so he had a lot of possessions in one of the rooms of the temple, and those were removed. He returned the Levites to their posts. They weren't getting their tithes. They'd had to go back to the farm. They reinforced the Sabbath laws. Men who had married foreign women were rebuked, and he then says, was it not because of marriages like these that King Solomon sinned? So there was a real reason to stop intermarriage with people of foreign descent or who were from other countries. And he drove away the son-in-law of Sanballat. His final sentence of the book of Nehemiah, remember me with favor, O my God, is actually, I think, the 4th time he says that within the book. about each time that he does something that's important, he puts that in. Now, the question to me is, what does that say about him, about Nehemiah? Why is he doing all of this work? What do you think? Michael's back there with the microphone and has a passion to use it. So, does this say his motives were impure or they were touched by a strong desire just to please God? But remember me with favor. What does that mean? 1 second. Michael approaches. I know, but we'll magnify.
Just get an impression here that this guy has just dropped everything and he's seen the need to focus and go on point and get the job done. The world falls aside. To a point, he had to set guards so that we could stay on focus and get the job done. But it was just a very simple matter of he had an immediate conviction. I got to start down this path, and he wasn't even thinking about what's coming with it. You know, he thought as he went along from there. And beyond that, I'm not too deep.
Okay. Any other comments? There's.
So my first thought was somewhat, he's expecting something in return. But as I think about it, it's actually more humility than probably most of us can gather, because he's basically saying, you owe me nothing. I did this because I love you, and I love Jerusalem, and I love God. So all I ask is that you, at a minimum or at a maximum, that you just remember me with favor. So I see it that way, that he's expecting nothing. He did it because of his love for God, and he's just saying, I hope you'll remember me with favor for what I've done, but I'm still happy that I did it for you.
Okay, good thought. Any others? Well, if not, a couple points to keep in mind. Number one tiny thing can lead to huge results. And sometimes each of us sees things that need to be done, but we just sort of decide to let somebody else do them, or we don't, for whatever reason, undertake them. Sometimes we don't understand what a great thing might result from what appears to be a fairly small thing. The second thing is that we can look to the book of Nehemiah to see a man who became, I think, obsessed, Dennis, with the idea of completing the walls and bringing Jerusalem back to its former glory. And he took every step that was necessary, and he did so in each case after praying fervently to God. And he, in that way, used faith basically to move a mountain, I think, in the sense that Jesus intended it. Thanks again for being here this morning, and we'll adjourn now for our worship service.